welcome, and very pleased to have Jim Fraser here. He's a professor at NYU in History and Education, and is a historian who brings a huge amount of perspective, particularly around areas of history around teacher education and religion and education, and we're looking forward to having a conversation today about a number of issues. Before you came to NYU, Jim, you were at the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, as I recall,
Yes.
and have also been in other universities, as the bio, which we hope is posted next to this, can give indication. And you are also, appropriately so for this series, the current president, at least for another week or so, of the History of Education Society. So indeed a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining this series.
Pleasure to be part of the conversation. Look forward to it.
Great, great. So let's start off with an area that today, at least, and I'm going to guess you tell us for a good period of time, has been an area of some controversy and question and challenges in terms of how do we find, how do we prepare, how do we support teachers in the nation's schools. And you've written a history of that back in 2007, TC
Yes.
Press, and a number of other pieces along the way. And I'm wondering what your thoughts, having looked at it over time, what are your thoughts about the state of teacher education today, and what is it that history can help shed light on?
Well, it's really fascinating because history of teacher education today is so much highly contested, and we have people who are in schools of education defending themselves, often saying we're doing just fine, or there are people within ed schools who really want to reform, and there are people outside of ed schools who've sort of given up on ed schools and say we just have to blow them up and start all over again. Stepping back from all of that and looking at this history, and the time I took to write the book was really a great experience for me. What I realized is that we've been having this debate in one form or another since about 1830.
1830.
That the 1830, the concern with teacher education, the frustration with teacher education, the anger about the fact that teachers aren't being prepared the way reformers, people in the society, want them to be prepared, is a very long-standing debate. And it's taken different forms at different times, but it's certainly been an ongoing battle. The other major lesson I learned once I got into this history, and it was full of surprises, I set out to write a history of the ways teachers were prepared. When I started to write the book, there are a number of good books that focus on sort of the roots of ed schools. But I wanted to ask a different question, not what are the roots of what we have today, but how, in fact, in 1830 or 1890 or 1920, were the majority of the nation's teachers prepared? And what I discovered was that the norm of everybody goes to a school or a college or Department of Education in a university-based teacher education program was actually the norm for about a 30-year period between 1960 and 1990. The norm in the long run of this nation's history has been what we today call alternative routes. There were many different ways to get into teaching. And in the 19th century, to my utter surprise, the major way you became an elementary school teacher was you took what was called the normal course, the teacher preparation course, in a high school. Majority of 19th century elementary teachers were high school graduates who had gone to high schools and high schools at that point offered what we can call the general course, or commercial course, a college prep course, and a normal course. And you could take the normal course and become an elementary school teacher. There were also lots of other alternatives. There were what were called independent state normal schools. There were some teacher institutes. There were lots of people who just took an exam and passed the exam and became a teacher with no preparation at all. And all of these things were competing with each other. As late as 1930, the federal government set as a national goal, not an achievement, but a national goal for the future, that every teacher should have at least 2 years of college. So the norm was not that people would be college graduates. They do high school programs, they do institutes, they do normal schools that were often more like high schools than colleges. And that only began to change after World War II. And even after World War II, it changed fairly slowly, so that it was in 1960 when the last state passed laws saying that teachers needed to be college graduates, and that most states adopted programs where you went to a state-approved program based in a university, college, or school, or department of education. And that became pretty much the norm. There were exceptions always, but that was pretty much the norm for that 30-year period. The interesting thing is that that's the 30-year period when most of us became teachers. Most of the people in the field of teacher education became teachers. So for us, the way it's always been done is the way it was done for a fairly limited time. For historians, it's a different issue. And that's changing now.
So how do you see that trajectory? Is it one of this is simply a reflection for teacher preparation of the rising levels of education more generally that the population had? So if you had essentially a secondary level education and then a normal school setting in the 19th century and then taught, you were more educated still than lots of the folks in your community and so forth. Is that part of what you see happening? Is it also, though, a reflection of, when you think about teacher institutes and other kinds of institutional shapes that existed over time, are the different alternative routes today, as well as the different institutions that are growing up? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you see non-university-based teacher preparation and support programs. What kind of history or lineage do you think those have? Is there something new about those now, or are those reincarnations of tendencies we've had at other periods?
You ask a couple of really complicated questions that are fun. So let me start with your question about why is it that we ended up with this focus on university-based teacher preparation after about 1960? And clearly the root, I don't mean to imply that all of a sudden in 1960 it started. It was as early as the 1890s. Universities were preparing teachers. It was just that in the 1960s they became the only route into teaching, and that was a significant change. I think part of it is what you alluded to. Part of it is that we have a rising level of education. We have more and more people. Remember, in the early 1900s, only a tiny proportion of the population even went to high school. So when John Dewey and a lot of others were having arguments about the high school curriculum in the early 1900s, they were talking about a curriculum that served something like 5% of the population. At that point, nearly all teachers were elementary school teachers. As high schools become the norm, teaching becomes a profession. Preparing people to be teachers is preparing people to be either elementary or secondary teachers. And that's part of what raises the standard for all teacher preparation. Whether one is going to teach first grade or high school, one is joining a profession, and I think that's part of the effort. And as you said, we have a more educated population. There's more pressure on the teacher who is the elementary teacher or the high school teacher to be well-educated herself or himself. So I think that's certainly part of the story. I think another part of the story is that after World War II, universities consolidate their ownership, in some sense, over a great deal of education. Earlier in the 19th century, earlier in the 20th century, one could become a lawyer without necessarily going to law school. That was the way many people became lawyers, but there were also other routes into law. As we get into the post-World War II era, the notion of being a professional means you go to a professional program in a university. And universities, for good and sometimes for ill, gained control over entry into all the professions. And that's a newer development, again, than many people recognize. And so teachers wanted to be part of that. Universities wanted to be part of it. But universities originally were sort of mostly interested in preparing high school teachers. Then they sort of take over the whole enterprise, and as that's consolidated, also from the very beginning has its critics. There are huge exposés of university-based teacher education being published in the very early 1960s. And so it's not like we started to be dissatisfied with that sometime later. But I think that as a society, we trusted universities to do more professional preparation. Teachers wanted that recognition. Universities wanted to control the programs, and so that did become a kind of norm. You asked a second question, which is interesting, about so what happens later? How are we getting to where we are now? And I'm actually fascinated with that because, while I've talked about this sort of 30-year period of university dominance, in 1990, in the early 1990s, it starts to come unglued. And actually, my colleague, former Dean Mary Brabeck, and I have embarked on a project to write another book, looking specifically at what's happened in teacher preparation since 1990, and looking as historians and as administrators just at that very brief 25 years between 1990 and the present. 1990 is when Wendy Kopp launches Teach for America. It's when the state of New Jersey passes legislation that there can be alternative routes into teacher preparation. It's still in 1990 the dominant way is to go through schools of education. It's still the dominant way, but far less so. And all of a sudden, the critics move from just saying, how are we going to improve it? What do we need to do to change it? To maybe we should blow the whole thing up and have a different way to get people into teaching. And that becomes a very different debate than the debate that was going on in the previous 30 years. And it's a debate which state legislatures get involved in, foundations get involved in. If you follow the money from the major national foundations or the federal government, people are investing in alternative routes a lot more than they're investing in traditional university teacher preparation. It leaves those of us who are wanting to improve university-based teacher education, but frustrated that it's improving so slowly, kind of caught in the middle. We've got the people on the one hand who are saying everything's fine in universities, and people on the other hand saying, blow them up and develop something different. We're trying to say, let's find the middle ground, got to make them better. But I think part of this is the emergence of critics who had a different vision. I think part of it is that we as a society have lost faith in major institutions, whether it's the federal government, state governments, universities, and people are looking for other ways of doing things. So, I think it's going to be an interesting next 25 years as this history moves forward, but we're in the middle of a sea change as dramatic as the sea change that led to university dominance. By at least one estimate, 40% of the new teachers who entered teaching this September came from some kind of alternative route, whether that was an alternative program within a university, the University of Phoenix, which is developing its own program, Teach for America, or other programs like that. But only 60% of the new teachers this year are from traditional university and school programs. That's a huge change, and understanding where that's going to go is going to be interesting.
Yeah. In that you mentioned the route through universities for other professions, becoming a lawyer or a doctor and so forth. And I'm wondering whether or not, some have said that part of this is as you mentioned, the doubt or lessening of faith in institutions and major institutions. Some have said it's also a doubting of the role of professions or the autonomy of different professions. So if I can go online and get a number of legal services from something that it's far more economical than it could before, or I can seek medical advice on WebMD or something else. I can go in there armed with different information, and now I have a different role vis-a-vis these professionals. Is that something at play? Are there other? So that's sort of one set of questions, and I guess the other is your own sense of how teacher education and preparation fits into our changing sense of what we want the schools to be doing.
Yes. There's that
Just
question.
that minor thing, yes.
Right. So, in terms of the changes in all of the professions, these are huge. I mean, the notion of people going to a physician and saying, my life is in your hands, doctor, whatever you say, is gone. And people in medical school here at NYU or in almost any university anywhere are very aware that they are also under a microscope, that they're being criticized, that they may have been preparing people who were good scientists and technicians, but not necessarily very good on the interpersonal relationships that are a critical part of healing, that they were better on curing diseases than on public health. And so medical education is in the middle of a sea change and very much subject to critique. And I think we as a society, for good and for ill, but more for good, no longer are willing to say, oh, you're the professional, we trust you. Whether that professional is the medical doctor or a member of the clergy or a lawyer or a teacher. I think it's been exacerbated in the world of teaching because people are not very happy with the school. And there's reason to be complaining about the quality of American education. We're not, by the PISA tests and other things, our education is not first in the world as it was for a very long time. People are asking what's going on, and so there's some other norms. And if you try to fix schools, pretty soon you get to looking at what's going on with teachers and the preparation of teachers and the people who are the main professionals in that profession. So there's a lot of stuff at play here, both a general social movement to ask, if not distrust, at least ask a whole lot more questions about professionals and professional preparation than a previous generation did. And at the same time, a particular dissatisfaction with the quality of American education, the quality of schools, and that leads, and these two things sort of collide, which mean that if all professional education is under a microscope, teacher preparation is under a microscope with the heat turned up. And I think that's just inevitable for those of us in the field. Which leads to your second question. You have this interesting way of asking these two-part questions. Your second question, which is has to do with what do we want our schools to accomplish, and that's a really interesting question. In fact, again, to ask a historian that question, because as I look at the history of schooling in the United States in the last 200 years, what I find is an institution with actually fairly slowly changing institutional structures. We have elementary schools, we have secondary schools, we have classes with a certain number of people, we have textbooks. But what we as a society want those institutions to accomplish has changed in extraordinary ways. If you were to ask Horace Mann, the quote father of American education, in fact, he was not the father of anything, but he was he helped institutionalize a lot of the structure of school. If you asked Horace Mann, what's the purpose of schooling? Or if you told Horace Mann that today we're really concerned with preparing people for professional life and making sure that we have really strong people who can compete internationally, he would have said, what? What are you talking about? His notion of the purpose of schooling was to create patriotic Americans, to create people who could be informed, who could participate actively in the democratic process, who had some loyalty to the nation, some understanding of the nation. By the 1890s, in the progressive era, we get much more of a concern with including those who were previously not included, in recognizing and respecting certainly, John Dewey is very articulate on this, respecting the diversity of the American people and creating, although he didn't use the word, a multicultural society that again can be an effective democratic society. If you ask people today, what's the purpose of schooling? It's to make, and many people will respond, it's to make sure people can get a good job, it's to make sure our economy functions, It's to make sure that we are keeping up economically with competitors. All of these are fairly recent. They were there in the past, but they were not the primary concerns. The fact that these are primary, that we want education to be really not only the vehicle of upward mobility, but the solution to a society which is becoming more and more unequal in economic terms, that's fairly new. And so we get these constant tug and pull about, if you're a teacher, just what are you supposed to accomplish? Today, it's clearly, teachers are feeling enormous pressure about, it's to make sure that our students do well on standardized tests, because we need to make sure that they are ready to participate to their own benefit and to society's benefit in a larger economic system. We hear there is lip service toward the civic mission of schools, but if you really probe very deeply in terms of priorities, it's pretty low on the list today. So those kind of changes are really extraordinary, and they make it hard for, I think, teachers and teacher preparation people who, are being criticized because you aren't producing the kinds of professionals we, the society, wants, when the society keeps changing its mind on what it wants.
Mm-hmm. And is there a sense? I mean, I think back to the some work I was looking at in the early part of the 1900s, 19-teens, and others, and the complaints of the turnover rates that we saw for new teachers coming into the field, and their exhaustion as what they saw as sort of unforgiving conditions, particularly in rural areas and others, and this kind of constant instability, and partly owing, it seemed, to the purposes that they were being asked to advance by their communities, as well as the intrusions into their own lives and everything else, I suppose, seemed overwhelming. And I'm wondering do you have any sense of, is part of what we're seeing, which part of what we're seeing now, what you described as this fascinating shift from 1990 forward, is a part of that shifting way in which we understand professions and prepare them, and how much of it is, are we overloading this, are we outsourcing to teachers so many of these larger questions about what we want society to be about? And so, of course, some are saying, well, we're just asking teachers to do all the things that, I'm thinking, of course, somebody else who will be interviewed in this series, David Lavery, on how we sort of educationalized, right, all of our social issues. Do you have any thoughts on that, or how teachers over time have fared relative to those kinds of?
I think it's all of the above, and one factor that is very much at play today is that young people, my students, do not have the interest in a profession that they will pursue for the rest of their lives, the way my generation was encouraged to think of having a profession that you would then, you'll become a minister, you'll become a doctor, you'll become a lawyer, and that's what you'll do. It's not just that people don't think of teaching that way. People don't think of professional life that way. People think of, in the kind of world of technological change that we're living in, they much more think about, maybe I will do this for 5 years, and then I'll find something else and move into that. Maybe I'll be a consultant for a while. Maybe I'll take on some administrative responsibilities and work in a bureaucracy for a while. Maybe I'll move on to something else. The notion of a lifetime profession is significantly less across the board in American society than it was a generation or two ago. Mm. And that's having a huge impact on teaching. So when many schools of education still say we're preparing people for a lifetime in the teaching profession, and Teach for America says we're preparing people to teach for a couple of years, but our goal is to make sure that we have lots of people in the larger society who understand what it means to be a school teacher and understand schools from the inside, and our voters or political leaders. These are two different goals. And no wonder they so often just sort of talk past each other in the larger dialogue. And as somebody who is sometimes responsible for how schools operate, I get very frustrated at the notion of kind of a 2-year turnover of teaching. Most of the evidence says you start to get really good as a teacher about year 3 or 4, and we certainly need some people in the schools who will stay for a much longer period of time, if not their whole careers. Perhaps we also need to be restructuring the profession, and David Lebery, among others, is really good on this question about, maybe this notion that we have this very flat profession where somebody becomes a school teacher and then does that for the next 40 years, or does it for a couple of years and then quits teaching altogether, is the wrong notion, as opposed to thinking of our schools as having some kind of maybe of a rotating teaching force, but also leaders who are professional leaders who are teachers, not principals or administrators removed from the classroom. And that there are different ways to think about that. I think that might be a way of addressing some of what you're talking about, because we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. We're not going to go back to a society in which I became a teacher at 22 and retired from teaching. Early 19th century that you were talking about, people rotated in and out of teaching. It was basically considered a woman's career until she got married. Most cities had laws saying a married woman couldn't teach. So many people taught for a few years, then got married, moved on to other things. And a much larger proportion of the whole population had taught school, which was a good thing for support for schools. I think it was that rapid turnover was a very bad thing for the quality of what went on in classrooms. But we need to be much more creative about finding ways to address that. But we are, again, in the middle of a social sea change.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to give you an opportunity for any other thoughts on teacher education and teacher as profession, and then I want to shift to another area of interest. Do you have any other final thoughts on?
My only final thought is that I'm really intrigued to figure out even more what's going on. I mean, we've been talking about it some, but something larger in our society is going on. That in 1985, if you wanted to be a teacher, you basically went to an ed school. There were, occasional people got alternative licenses or something like that, but that was a norm. By 1995, that expectation was gone. Part of it is the issues we've been talking about. Part of it is a larger distrust in institutions. Part of it is all of this turmoil about schools and people think certainly there must be a different way. But I think there's more there. And so I want to keep drilling down, and I'm really curious about any other opinions you or any others collect, because I am determined before we publish this next book to figure out what else is going on that we have this kind of a change. And then, of course, the question is, what do we do about it? What does this mean for schools of education? Does it mean we're never again in the foreseeable future going to be the only route into teaching? But how do we make sure we're the best route into teaching for those of us who are in it? How do we make sure that we rethink our work to do that? That's really an open question.
And I just as an interest, maybe something you're already into, is one of the things that's always intrigued me, and I know very little about, is the history of preparation of teachers who have been the standing alternate route for a very long time, which is entry of teachers into private schools and their own preparation over time. And we recently at Penn had a group of private schools come to us to do some work with their new teachers. And many independent schools that's not been a favorable disposition over the years, and it's very interesting to see what it is that they're looking to do with the university and what things they do on their own, as a vehicle, as a lens perhaps on some of those things you're trying to get at. It sounds fascinating.
That's a great suggestion, and I think looking more at the preparation of people who teach in private schools, which have not gone through the same route at all, will shed light on this conversation.
Yeah, interesting. So let me take a bit of a shift here, because I know another interest of yours, another area that you've done research and writing on, as well as from your own personal background. There are that many historians. Maybe there are, and I'm just not aware, who would bring MDivs as well into the background as well as history. And so I want to get your thoughts. This is certainly a recurring issue in schooling in all sorts of ways, whether it has to do with curricular choices, to notions of character, to appropriate use of prayer and so forth, different kinds of lightning issues, if you will, or lightning rod issues that come up. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on having looked at the history of the relationship between religion and education in the U.S., guideposts or lessons that you think you've gleaned by looking at those trends over time.
Well, let me start with a personal note. Based on your introduction, I am a ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and a historian of education. I generally had kept those worlds pretty separate, and in the 1990s, Nancy Richardson, who was then Associate Dean at Harvard Divinity School, asked me to come give a series of lectures on the topic that we're talking about now. How is religion related to public education? And my response was, Nancy, I don't know anything about that topic. And Nancy said, look, you're a minister and you're a historian, figure it out. That's how I got involved in doing research in this field. When Nancy says that kind of thing, one does it. And I've been at it ever since, and so I published, eventually those lectures got published as Between Church and State, Religion and Public Education in a Multicultural America. And I'm right now involved in a second edition of that book, so I'm back into the topic, and I'm also teaching about it at an undergraduate course at NYU, where I have 66 freshmen and sophomores studying how religion is related to public education in the United States, which I think the fact that I have so many students says that there's interest in this floating around. And that interest is in part because, again, religion in the schools is a contentious issue in 2014, as it's been a contentious issue at many times in the nation's past. And so part of my interest is simply the interest of somebody who worries a lot, thinks a lot about public education in the 21st century, and sees that the issues of prayer in schools, the issue of how one teaches evolution in a religiously diverse culture and society, the issue of ethics and values. These are all issues that are contested, and if the contests go bad, they become among the most divisive issues in our society. And so it's some sense my overall interest in this, besides it's a fascinating topic to me, my overall interest in this is, how do we create a 21st century United States in which we live together with respect for our diversity, but also engaged in a civil society? That's a significant question. And religion can both be something that binds us together and something that blows us apart. So that's sort of the overview of part of my interest in this field.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think back to, I've told this story to my own students, and that is, I think back to when I dropped my daughter off at the first day of school. Mm-hmm. It, to me, my mind has been a touchstone in the sense that I never thought in my mind, gee, I really hope she meets Common Core Standard number 10.5 today. I had notions about what I wanted her to be, excited, and so forth, and a large part of that had to do with her own sense of her values and her own mission in the world and things that really have been the traditional purview of religious traditions and faiths and so forth. And yet we sort of lessons, I suppose, from I'm thinking of your colleague's book, John Zimmerman's book on, when it comes to ethnicity and race, we can figure out ways to tuck in extra pages in the history book. When it comes to religion, we pretty much like to just avoid the subject. Yes. And I'm wondering if given, as you said earlier, that man's interest in the schools and the requirement that we pay for each other's children's education has to do with creating some citizenship that at some level has values and draws upon some sense of at least a faith in what future we want to have together. And I'm wondering how you uh, how you see this over time. This, in a sense, it's a reconciliation maybe of a secular faith in an atmosphere of multiple faiths. And how does have we seen major shifts in that? Have we persistently just avoided the subject as much as we could? I guess, how do you see that?
I think we have seen major shifts over the again the course of. As a historian, I always want to take the big picture look here.
Yes.
And certainly, at the course of American history, we have seen some pretty significant shifts, and I think those shifts have often been related to a kind of confusion about where we do want to go. You know, we are governed by a constitution that starts out in the First Amendment saying, you know, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I told my students that was the only thing they had to memorize this semester. They had to know that line. But in fact, at the time it was passed, nobody was quite sure what it meant. And today, nobody's quite sure what that First Amendment means. I mean, just to go back in that history, for James Madison, who wrote the First Amendment, he was clearly deeply committed to what we call the separation of church and state. He wanted, he'd written not long before that, the legislation in Virginia that meant people stopped paying taxes to support the Anglican Church. He thought churches were better off if the government stayed out of them. He thought government was much better off if the church stayed out of government life. And he wanted moving on in separation. On the other hand, Madison was a wily politician. And to get the First Amendment through Congress, he needed the votes of particularly Connecticut and Massachusetts that at that point still had state-established churches. People in those states paid taxes to support the Congregational Church. So his line, Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion, promised that the federal government wouldn't mess with the established church in Connecticut or Massachusetts. So he got a coalition that got an amendment passed, but it's also an amendment which we can now, do we mean separation of church and state, or do we mean something else? And at what point is separation of church and state? What does that mean? So the uncertainty has dogged our approach to this issue as a society, and usually, to our earlier conversation, this comes back to these issues, if they're a clash in society, are a major clash in the schools. Mm-hmm. So just a sort of a quick overview, if you look at the 19th century, I think it's fair to say throughout most of the 19th century, public schools were pretty much Protestant schools. Protestant, maybe not Protestant parochial schools, but something close to that. Mm-hmm. Leaders of public education couldn't see that. But for especially growing numbers of Catholics with increasing Irish and then Italian immigration, people are saying, wait a minute, why are we reading all of this curriculum? Why are we starting the school day with readings from a Protestant Bible or Protestant prayers or textbooks that sometimes are dismissive of Catholics? And certainly in New York, there's a major effort to get public funding for Protestant schools and Catholic schools separately. It fails, and out of that is launched a whole national parochial school system, which functions on the contributions of very poor people and the service of nuns who've taken a vow of poverty. And that's runs as sort of outside of and parallel to the public and publicly funded system. And that goes on certainly for the, still goes on today very much, but it was the major part of the 19th century educational configuration. By the 20th century, and at a time when we have growing Jewish immigration, immigration from other parts of the world, public schools do become more secular. And there is a notion, I think, in early 20th century public schools, exactly what you say. Well, religion is something that you don't mention very much here. I've got one line I want to read, which is in this lovely book, The Promised Land by Mary Anton, talks about what it's like to be a young Jewish immigrant in the United States in the very early years of the 20th century. And she's from a Jewish family, a Jewish home in Russia. She comes to Chelsea, Massachusetts, begins attending public school, and sees the public school as the opportunity compared to the oppression that Jews suffered in Russia. But then one day in Chelsea, she gets into this fight with her friends on the playground about whether they believe in God or not. And she writes, "The issue was resolved after recess by the teacher who made me understand that it was proper American conduct to avoid religious arguments in school territory. I felt honored by this private initiation into the doctrine of the separation of church and state, and I went to my seat with a good deal of dignity, my alarm about the safety of the Constitution allayed by the teacher's calmness." I love that story. This is of a fourth grader. But it's also a story of how schools, we mention ethnicity, we mention other kinds of diversity. Religion, we don't mention very much. But again, that never works because, at the simplest level, you can't teach history or literature or other fields without religious issues cropping up all the time. Tell the story of the Crusades in a world history class and don't mention religion. Tell the story of the Civil Rights Movement and don't mention the significance of black churches. Tell the story of the Civil War and don't mention the way abolitionism was in many ways a religious crusade. You can't do it, and so religion keeps coming up. But it also comes up in other ways, and I have found myself particularly fascinated by the famous Scopes trial, the Tennessee trial in 1925, in which John Scopes was accused of having taught evolution. Said, yes, I taught evolution. And it became the national, the trial of the century in some huge national media focusing on it. 90 years later, we haven't resolved the issue. There are schools in many parts of the country, and not just in sort of rural isolated areas, but in Queens and other places where high school biology teachers worry about some of their students. And it's, again, I'm convinced that a conservative student, whether that student is a conservative Christian or a Navajo traditionalist or somebody coming out of some other religious tradition, needs to be safe and comfortable in the public schools. At the same time, we can't teach modern science and not teach evolution. So we need to worry about that more, and we need to think about how the biology teachers, being prepared in NYU or other places, understand how to teach evolution, but also how to be respectful of students in their classroom for whom this is a tricky issue. You aren't respectful by shutting up, but you are respectful by making school a safe place. So it's another example of the tensions around this issue. And the one other thing I'll say about this is when we handle it badly, these things become very divisive. And so what we've seen in the United States is a growing opting out of public education, whether it's the development of Jewish day schools, which are more and more popular, whether it's the development, the sort of kind of resurgence of Catholic parochial schools, whether it's the growth, a new phenomenon, which is independent Protestant schools. But at this point in American history, 14 states have passed legislation allowing citizens to divert a portion of their state tax money to scholarship funds that will send children to private religious schools. It's a kind of funny end run. So the state doesn't contribute to those schools, but they don't just make it tax deductible. You can actually divert a portion of your taxes to these scholarship funds, which then are undermining the public school system, which is the place traditionally where we have brought our people together. So, I want schools to be respectful of religious diversity, in part because I think it's the right thing to do. But I want schools to be respectful of religious diversity because I worry about this kind of opting out where people grow up only speaking to people, only knowing people who share their religious views, but then are supposed to participate in a democratic society where there's a much greater diversity of people. So we have a lot of work to do on this topic.
Well, I know our time is coming to a close, but I wanted to ask one other question along a slightly different direction on that, because one of the things that seems striking to me in the current religious landscape in the U.S. has been the growth in those who claim no institutional affiliation. I think it's one of the largest groups, if not the largest group now, of those who say they are none.
Yes.
And yet, there seems strong interest across the board, as you're saying, in terms of both the students and the adults around more generally, in areas that would at least reasonably called spiritual in various ways. And sort of interesting borderlines in in teaching practices, say, that go under a rubric of mindfulness or yogas and other kinds of things that have deep religious roots in many cases, but are part of school approaches towards stress management or concentration or whatever it might be. And I'm just wondering whether or not you're seeing an interesting sort of route there for what sort of an entrance of the products of some religious traditions without the labels and the traditions entering through those means or not, or if you have any thoughts on that.
You're raising at least two really significant points. I'm going to start with the second one and come back to the first one. I'm very nervous about the introduction of yoga and mindfulness into schools. I understand it's being done with the greatest of goodwill. But in some sense, taking some of the core of perhaps Buddhist or Hindu spirituality and then trying to cut it off from its core and introduce it as a kind of technique into the schools does a disservice to the religious core of practice. It also is a bit of an end run, so that while that may be perfectly fine and perfectly comfortable to a student who is of a pretty secular family, it's probably not going to be comfortable or acceptable to a student who comes from a conservative Christian family, or for that matter, from an observant Buddhist or Hindu family. That notion that we can slip it in without attending to those issues. It for me, is a modern version of the way Horace Mann tried to go back to the 1830s. Horace Mann tried to solve this issue by saying, well, we'll have the schools read the Bible without note or comment, and then everybody can debate the Bible at home. And Catholics said, but Catholics believe in reading the Bible in light of the teachings of the Church, not just reading it without note or comment. And he never got that point. I think the same issue is there today. On the other hand, I'm very sympathetic with what people are trying to struggle with. How do we create a manageable classroom? That's not always an easy issue. But how do we respect the growing number of Americans who will say, like spirituality, I am a spiritual person, this is important to me, but institutional religion, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, is just not for me. I'm disconnected from that. That is the fastest growing portion of the population, if it's not currently the largest single portion of the population. So we have this interesting change going on in our society where the growing sort of evangelical Christian movement is sort of plateaued. Liberal Christian movements, Catholic and Protestant, are probably shrinking. We have growing, partly because of immigration, partly because of conversion, growing Buddhist, Hindu, certainly growing numbers of Muslims, and this very fast growing, I don't want to be part of those institutions, but I want something. And your job as a school teacher at PS3 in Manhattan is to have students who may be from all those traditions, and you want to create a democratic society and a respectful society in that classroom. I don't think slipping stuff in is the way to do it. I personally do think that we have, it's funny, the whole discussion of multicultural education, which usually looks at gender, race, ethnicity, does have something to offer to this conversation about religion. If we can say, how are we going to create respectful diversity and knowledge of diversity? That's really useful. So I've been spending some of my own time lately looking at how schools in other countries deal with this issue. And, we Americans like to solve all our problems ourselves without ever looking anywhere else. But I've visited schools in England and France where they have very different approaches. So the French approach is religion is private, keep it out of the public sphere. Do not wear a headscarf into school in France. Do not talk about it in France. It's very much like Mary Anton. It's private. It's fine. Don't bring it into the public sphere. The English approach, at the best, and they're uneven in this, is to say, let's bring it all into the public sphere. And so they have required courses in religion, which are often, at their best, not teaching people the truth of some religion, but a kind of comparative religion in which the very differences of the English population, which is certainly much more secular than ours. So there's lots of people for whom this is all just sort of new stuff, but maybe some spirituality. Growing Muslim population, some people who are still adherents of the Church of England, Catholics, Jews. How do we put our diversity at the center of the school curriculum and learn from each other? I'm much intrigued with that, and I think we have lessons to learn that will take us a long way in the future.
Fantastic. Very interesting work. Thank you. I've used a good deal of your time. I want to know if there's anything else that you would want to any concluding thoughts or comments or anything generally on how you see the utility of history or even guidance to particular works of yours that you think would be good as starting points for folks interested in following up on your thoughts.
I'll think of the perfect thing just as soon as we sign off. But I think this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Oh, good.
We've got a lot of ground here.
I think so. And I thank you very much. And I do encourage folks who are watching this to consult the list of publications and other materials and other ways to dig in further to the kind of thinking and writing that you've had over the years. So thank you so much for participating.
I welcome this as a continuing dialogue. If people have thoughts, get in touch.
Excellent.